Now let us hear from John 6. After this, Jesus went to the other side of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. Now, a large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. And Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with the disciples. And now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And he looked up and he saw this crowd coming towards him. And Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for all these people to eat?" And he said this to test him, for Jesus knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not be enough to buy bread for even just a little of them. And one of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." And now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, all 5,000 of them. It's important to note, though, that only men were counted, so there were probably about 10,000 people, with women and children. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed it to all those who were seated, and so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments, the leftovers, so that nothing may be lost." And so they gathered them up, and the fragments of the 5 barley and loaves were eaten and filled 12 more baskets. And when the people saw all the signs that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I don't know about you guys, but I love bloopers. I love watching bloopers on ESPN when the 2 guys smack into each other. I love bloopers from newscasters when a bee gets in their way. I love bloopers from TV shows. I love bloopers. And so, of course, I also love clergy bloopers. And we're so nerdy enough that we clergy have whole pages dedicated to certain types of bloopers, and one of them is communion bloopers. And I have heard some good ones. Like the one where the pastor went to the table and there was juice but no bread. Or the one time a roach darted across the table during the Lord's Prayer, and he said, "Thank goodness everyone's head was bowed. I went on." Or there was one where the port wine had gone sour in the basement in the summer heat, and they didn't realize it until it was actual communion time, and people would dip their bread and bring out a soggy, stringy mess. And even at this church, I heard a good one. Maybe some of y'all will remember when, I think it was Jenny, was down here and someone had put a little rubber ducky in the cup. That's not so much a blooper, but it's funny. But one of my favorite communion bloopers is from a church I served in Austin. The church that used linens much like ours, but their deacons took them home to wash the linens. And the pastor went to the table and started taking off the linens from the bread and from the juice. But this particular pastor, he's kind of, well, different. And he liked to do things very dramatically. And so he would take off the linens and snap them and close them and lay them on there. Just, it was bizarre. But this one day he did it. And he popped the linen and a pair of ladies' undies. Yeah. So, needless to say, this dramatic entrance and formal communion was lost that day. But it was indeed a communion, a meal to remember. And it's often those moments when we get knocked off our game, right, that we are given these great moments to remember. As we know from last week, Jesus and the disciples were certainly off their game. They needed to relax, to rejuvenate, and the people just wouldn't stop needing from them. And we learned last week how desperate the people were. We came to understand what it means to stand at the edge of need and push in, to push on one another so that we get the chance just to reach out and touch Jesus. And this week we actually get there. It's from John, not Mark, but this week we get to be a part of the miracle. It didn't get left out this time. But we only get to be a part of the miracle today because last week we know what it's like to be hungry. Because we know what it's like to be desperate, to be unfilled. But worse, there were people here, desperate hunger. The people gathered needed to be healed. And here they were, also literally hungry. Here these people are gathered, just like we were last week, but they're in a deserted place. There's no Save-A-Lot across the road. They're in the middle of nowhere. And they are looking to Jesus and the disciples for both of these kinds of hunger. Spiritual, physical, and actual hunger. And the disciples, especially poor Philip, thinks they're about to have a little blooper on their hands. Because after all, it is the rabbi's job. And these guys are rabbis. It is their job to provide the food. And now, in my research, some people are vehemently against this story as a sacramental story. They're against it even being called or even associated with the sacrament of communion. They argue that just because it involves bread and Jesus doesn't make it sacrament status. But I don't think this is or is even like communion just because there's bread and Jesus present, but because of what you find out, but because it was Jesus feeding people with more than he had to start with. The technical definition of sacrament is an outward sign of inward grace. I see this story as a sacrament because this story tells us how Jesus reacts to the infusion of that inward grace. This is Jesus doing his thing. Just like when he was at the final meal, he saw an abundance of grace telling them, this isn't it. I got leftovers. There will be more supper, more hope, more of my love being given over and over and over and over, even after they kill me. Even after you deny me. Even after you don't have faith in me and you hide in the upper room. Even when you make fun of Thomas, even then there is grace and you don't have to find it. I will just give it to you. And when we look at the grace, instead of how the bread got there or how many people were fed, isn't that what we see? We see Jesus. We see his words and we see what he thinks is important. That sign of grace. And what Jesus thinks is important isn't how awesome it was, nor how he avoided a blooper. No, it was making sure that they continued to do the work even after the meal was over. And if that isn't communion, if that isn't reminiscent of the Last Supper, I must not get it. I must not know what communion is. In the story we just read, Jesus told the disciples, gather up the fragments that are left over so that nothing is lost. That's it. The real gospel in the story is that line. That even when we are fragments, when we feel like leftovers, lost, Jesus thinks we're worthy of being picked up and infused with grace. When the miracle is over, God is still looking for what's left. Because what's left is precisely the thing that needs grace the most. When Casey and I got married, we made our own communion ware. We went on one of those pottery places, you know what I'm talking about, where you make your own pottery. And so we did our communion ware, and we painted this large plate and a chalice. And on them we put our wedding scripture. And the cup says, there is no fear in love. And the plate says, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And we drew a threefold cord and tied it in the middle. When we moved here, we prayed that for all of our Waterford crystal and several other breakables